Everyone laughed when a bankrupt billionaire adopted a homeless black girl, learned she's a genius. The smell of industrial bleach mixed with unwashed bodies hit Warren Clay's nostrils as he pushed through the rusted double doors of Sacred Heart Shelter. 6 months ago, this scent would have made him gag. Now, it barely registered. Just like the threadbare clothes hanging loose on his once powerful frame, or the way his hands that used to sign billion-dollar deals, now gripped a mop handle with practiced ease. "Morning, Bill," called out Rosa Martinez, the shelter director, using the fake name Warren had given when he first showed up. She didn't look up from her paperwork, didn't see the way he flinched every time someone called him that. William Henderson was the name on his volunteer badge, complete with a fabricated backstory about being a retired teacher from Iowa. Simple. Forgettable. Everything Warren Clay had never been. "Morning, Rosa," he replied, his voice carrying none of the commanding presence that once filled boardrooms. He'd practiced speaking softer, walking smaller, being invisible. When you've been on the cover of Fortune magazine 14 times, anonymity becomes an art form. The irony wasn't lost on him. Warren Clay, the man who'd built Claystone Investments from a Harvard dorm room into a trillion-dollar empire, was now mopping floors in a South Chicago shelter that probably had a smaller budget than his old office's coffee service. The fall had been spectacular, documented by every financial news outlet on the planet. One day he was the king of crypto, and the next he was the biggest fraud in financial history. Except he wasn't a fraud. He'd been set up, framed by his own business partner who needed a scapegoat when their cryptocurrency platform collapsed. But try explaining that to the FBI when all the digital evidence pointed straight to your personal accounts. Try explaining that to the families who'd lost their life savings. Try explaining that to anyone when the entire world had already made up its mind. Warren wheeled his bucket toward the main dining area, where the morning rush was already beginning. Homeless men and women lined up for breakfast, their faces telling stories of addiction, mental illness, bad luck, and broken dreams. Stories not so different from his own, he'd learned. The only difference was that their falls hadn't been televised. "Bill! You're just in time for the show," chuckled Miguel Santos, one of the long-term residents. He was pointing toward the far corner of the dining hall, where several men were gathered around a makeshift table created from stacked milk crates. Warren followed Miguel's gaze and saw something that made him pause mid-step. A small black girl, no more than 10 years old, sat cross-legged on the floor across from a burly man with prison tattoos covering his arms. Between them was what could generously be called a chessboard, a piece of torn cardboard with hand-drawn squares, and the pieces were bottle caps, buttons, and random small objects. "That's little Zaria," Miguel explained, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Kid's been here 3 days straight. Hasn't said more than 5 words to anybody, but watch this." Warren watched. The tattooed man, who Miguel identified as Big Jim, a former truck driver, was studying the makeshift board with intense concentration. His forehead was beaded with sweat despite the cool morning air. Across from him, the girl sat perfectly still, her dark eyes focused not on the board, but somewhere in the distance, as if she was seeing something no one else could see. Big Jim finally moved a bottle cap, apparently his queen, and leaned back with satisfaction. "Got you now, little girl." Without hesitation, without even looking down at the board, Zaria reached forward and moved a small pebble 2 squares. "Checkmate," she said quietly. The men gathered around erupted in surprised laughter and groans. Big Jim stared at the board in disbelief, his mouth hanging open. Warren found himself stepping closer, his analytical mind automatically recreating the moves he'd witnessed. "How did she?" Big Jim started. "She saw it coming 6 moves ago," said Tommy Chin, an older Asian man Warren recognized as a former accountant. "I've been watching her all week. Kid doesn't just play chess, she thinks chess. Like it's her native language or something." Warren's pulse quickened. He'd been a decent chess player in college, good enough to beat most casual players but never competitive level. What he'd just witnessed wasn't casual level. That was several steps beyond anything he'd ever seen outside of professional tournaments. "Where'd you learn to play like that, sweetheart?" asked Rosa, who had appeared beside Warren with her clipboard. Zarya shrugged, finally looking up from the board. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, but guarded in a way that spoke of hard lessons learned young. "YouTube. At the library?" "YouTube?" Big Jim laughed. "You learned to play chess from YouTube videos?" "I learned everything from YouTube," Zarya said matter-of-factly. "Chess, math, how to read maps, how to find food when you're hungry." She paused, then added with a maturity that chilled Warren to the bone. "How to stay invisible when the adults stop caring." The group fell silent. Warren felt something crack inside his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his empire collapsed. It wasn't pity exactly. It was recognition. This child, sitting on a dirty floor playing chess with bottle caps, understood something about survival that most adults never learned. She understood what it meant to lose everything and keep going anyway. "Want to play?" The question was out of Warren's mouth before he could stop himself. Every head turned toward him. Warren rarely spoke during his volunteer shifts, preferring to stay in the background, invisible. Rosa looked particularly surprised. Zarya studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes seeming to look right through his carefully constructed disguise. Finally, she nodded once. Warren sat down across from her on the cold linoleum floor, his knees protesting the position. Up close, he could see that she was thin, too thin, and her clothes were clean but worn. Someone was taking care of her, but just barely. "I should warn you," Warren said as Zarya began setting up the pieces. "I'm pretty good at this game." For the first time since he'd been watching her, Zarya smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it transformed her entire face. "I know," she said quietly. "I can tell by how you're sitting. Most people sit like they're afraid of the board. You sit like you understand it." Warren blinked in surprise. In 2 sentences, this child had demonstrated more observational skill than most of his former employees. "What else can you tell? You're not from here," she said, moving her first piece, a small stone representing a pawn. "You talk like the TV people. And your hands are soft, but they've got new calluses. Recent work, physical work. And you smell like expensive soap even though your clothes are from Goodwill." Warren's blood went cold. If a 10-year-old could see through his disguise this easily, how long before someone else did? How long before a reporter or federal agent found him here? But Zarya wasn't finished. "You're running from something," she continued, her voice so quiet only he could hear. "Same as me. Difference is, I'm running from people who might hurt me. You're running from people who already did." Warren stared at her, his heart pounding. "What makes you say that?" "Your eyes," she said simply, then moved another piece. "Same look I had when I figured out my mama wasn't coming back. Like the world pulled the rug out from under you and you're still figuring out how to stand up again." The dining hall noise faded into background static. Warren found himself truly seeing this child for the first time, not as a curious chess prodigy or a tragic homeless girl, but as a fellow survivor. Someone who understood loss in a way that couldn't be taught or explained, only lived through. "Your move," Zarya said. Warren looked down at the board, at the makeshift pieces representing one of the world's oldest strategic games. He moved a bottle cap forward, and as he did, he felt something shift inside him. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about what he'd lost or who had betrayed him. He was thinking about the game. About the girl across from him who seemed to see everything and everyone with startling clarity. About the possibility that maybe, just maybe, his fall from grace wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning of a completely different one. 12 moves. That's all it took for Warren Clay, a man who'd once outmaneuvered Wall Street's finest, to realize he was completely outclassed by a 10-year-old girl using bottle caps as chess pieces. "Checkmate," Zarya said quietly, moving her makeshift knight, a small battery, into position. She said it the same way someone might mention the weather, as if defeating a grown man in chess was as natural as breathing. Warren stared at the board, his mind racing backwards through the game. He'd played aggressively, trying to intimidate her with bold moves. She responded like water flowing around rocks, turning every attack into a trap he didn't see coming until it was too late. "How?" he asked, genuinely stunned. "You think too much like a businessman," Zarya replied, already starting to pack up the pieces. "Always trying to take. Chess isn't about taking. It's about seeing." Big Jim let out a loud whistle. "Told you, Bill. Kid's something special." Warren watched as Zarya carefully placed each makeshift piece back into a worn cloth bag. Her movements were precise, methodical. Nothing wasted. "Where did you really learn to play like that?" "I told you. YouTube." She looked up at him, those sharp eyes reading his face. "You don't believe me." "It's not that I don't believe you," Warren said carefully. "It's just, what you just did requires years of study. Understanding patterns, seeing moves ahead." 13 moves? Zarya interrupted. "What?" "I saw 13 moves ahead. Not just the 12 it took to beat you." She stood up, brushing dust off her jeans. "Most people can only see 1 or 2 moves. Some can see 3 or 4. I see all of them." A chill ran down Warren's spine. In his business career, he'd met genuine prodigies, young programmers who could code like Mozart composed, mathematicians who saw numbers as colors. But this was different. This was raw intellectual power refined by necessity. "Zarya, honey," Rosa called from across the room. "Time for lunch." As the girl walked away, Warren found himself unable to move. Something was happening to him, something he hadn't felt since before his world collapsed. Purpose. Direction. The kind of electric recognition that had driven him to build his first company. Over the next 3 days, Warren found excuses to be wherever Zarya was. He watched her help elderly residents fill out forms, reading the fine print aloud and explaining terms that confused adults twice her age. He saw her quietly correct mistakes in the shelter's budget calculations when Rosa wasn't looking. Most remarkably, he observed her navigate complex social situations with an intuition that seemed almost supernatural. "She's been on her own for about 8 months," Rosa told him on Wednesday afternoon as they watched Zarya teach basic math to a group of younger children using colored markers and cardboard. "Mother overdosed in their apartment. Neighbors found Zarya 3 days later, sitting next to the body, reading a library book." Warren's stomach clenched. "What about Child Protective Services?" "That's the thing," Rosa said, lowering her voice. "Kids like smoke. Every time CPS shows up, she vanishes. Lives in laundromats, abandoned buildings, sometimes other shelters across town. Always moving, never staying long enough for the system to catch her. How does she survive?" "She's smart. Scary smart. Knows which restaurants throw out good food at what times. Knows which libraries let you stay longest. Knows which adults will help and which ones to avoid." Rosa shook her head sadly. "It's like she's got a PhD in survival at age 10. That evening, Warren made a decision that surprised even himself. He drove to a chess shop in downtown Chicago, the first time he'd left his neighborhood in months. Using cash and keeping his head down, he bought a proper chess set, 3 advanced strategy books, and a notebook. When he showed up at the shelter the next morning with the bag, Zarya was sitting in her usual corner, sketching geometric patterns on a scrap of paper. "Thought you might like these," Warren said, setting the chess set down beside her. Zarya's eyes widened. She reached out tentatively, running her fingers over the smooth wooden pieces. "These are real. The books are advanced," Warren warned. "College-level strategy guides." She picked up one of the books. "Grandmaster Tactics and Endgames," and flipped through it. Her eyes moved rapidly across the pages, absorbing diagrams and text with frightening speed. "I can read these," she said simply. "Zarya," Warren said, sitting down beside her. "What if I told you there was a way you could have books like this all the time? A safe place to sleep, regular meals, maybe even a real school." Her hand stopped turning pages. "You mean foster care?" "I mean a home. She looked at him with those two old eyes. Adults always want something. What do you want? The directness of the question hit Warren like a physical blow. What did he want? A week ago, he would have said he wanted his old life back. His money, his reputation, his empire. But sitting here beside this extraordinary girl who'd been failed by every system designed to protect her, Warren realized his answer had changed. I want to see what happens when someone like you gets the resources you deserve, he said honestly. I want to see what you become when you're not just surviving. Zarya studied his face for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled, a real smile this time, not the guarded expression she usually wore. Okay, she said quietly. But I get to keep playing chess. Warren felt something warm spread through his chest, a feeling he'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Deal, he said and meant it. As Warren left the shelter that afternoon, he was already mentally preparing for the battle ahead. Custody paperwork, background checks, legal proceedings. The system that had failed Zarya would try to block him at every turn. But Warren Clay hadn't built a billion-dollar empire by backing down from fights. This time, though, he wasn't fighting for money or power. He was fighting for something infinitely more valuable. Warren's one-bedroom apartment had never felt smaller. Not because Zarya took up much space. The girl was still rail-thin and seemed to instinctively make herself invisible, but because her presence filled every corner with an energy he'd forgotten existed. The energy of pure, unfiltered intelligence. Warren, she said on their third morning together, sitting cross-legged on his worn couch with a calculus textbook he'd borrowed from the library. This book is wrong. Warren looked up from his coffee, eyebrows raised. Wrong how? Page 247. The author made an error in the proof for the fundamental theorem. Look. She held up the book, pointing to a complex equation. He assumes the derivative exists at all points, but that's only true if the function is continuous. He never proves continuity first. Warren stared at her. He'd struggled through calculus in college with a B-. Zarya, how long have you been reading that book? Since yesterday after dinner? I finished it around midnight. She said this as casually as someone might mention finishing a magazine. Want me to show you the error? You read an entire calculus textbook in one night? I read fast, she said, then paused. Is that weird? Warren set down his coffee cup with shaking hands. Show me your homework from yesterday. She reached into her backpack, a new one he bought her, and pulled out sheets of paper covered in neat handwriting. Warren had given her basic algebra problems, thinking it would be a good starting point. Instead, she'd solved them all in minutes, then filled the remaining pages with geometric proofs he didn't recognize. Where did you learn to do these proofs? I made them up, Zarya said matter-of-factly. The algebra was too easy, so I started wondering about the shapes the equations make. Then I wondered if I could prove why they make those shapes. Warren felt the familiar electric tingle that used to hit him when he spotted a winning investment. Zarya, I want to try something. I'm going to show you some work papers from my old job. Business stuff. Think you could take a look? Her dark eyes lit up with curiosity. Okay. Warren retrieved a dusty box from his closet, documents he'd kept from Claystone Investments, including the algorithm specifications that had once made him billions. He spread the papers across his small dining table, watching as Zarya approached like a cat investigating something new. This is the platform that made me rich, Warren explained. It analyzed cryptocurrency patterns and predicted market movements. But it failed spectacularly. Cost people everything. Zarya leaned over the documents, her eyes moving rapidly across the complex formulas and data models. Warren expected questions, confusion, the normal reaction of someone encountering advanced financial mathematics. Instead, she was silent for nearly an hour, occasionally making small humming sounds. Finally, she looked up. I see the problem. You see the problem? Your algorithm assumes human behavior is rational, she said, pulling out a pencil. But humans aren't rational. They're emotional. Look here. She started drawing on the back of one of the papers. You built a perfect system for predicting what people should do, but you never accounted for what they actually do when they're scared. Warren's mouth went dry. What would you do differently? Add chaos variables, Zarya said, continuing to sketch. Not random chaos, human chaos. Fear patterns, greed patterns, panic patterns. People don't make decisions based on logic. They make decisions based on how they feel about logic. For the next 2 hours, Warren watched a 10-year-old girl redesign his life's work. She filled page after page with corrections, improvements, entirely new approaches he'd never considered. It was like watching Mozart rewrite a student's piano exercise. This could actually work, Warren whispered, staring at her modifications. Of course it could work, Zarya said. Your original idea was good. It just needed to account for humans being human instead of humans being computers. That afternoon, while Zarya was at the library, Warren began coding. For the first time since his empire collapsed, his fingers flew across the keyboard with purpose. He built a basic framework incorporating Zarya's insights, creating something entirely new from the ashes of his failure. He was deep in the code when his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message contained a single link to a news article. Warren's blood turned to ice as he clicked it. Bankrupt billionaire plays Daddy Warbucks. Warren Clay, the disgraced former crypto king, has reportedly adopted a homeless child in what sources call a desperate publicity stunt. The article was brutal. It painted him as a pathetic has-been trying to rehabilitate his image through charity. The comments were worse. People calling him a predator, a fraud, speculating about his motives. The worst part was the photo. Someone had taken a picture of him and Zarya leaving the courthouse after the custody hearing. Her face was blurred for privacy, but his wasn't. Warren's hands shook as he read comment after comment tearing him apart. Everything he'd worked to rebuild, the small sense of peace he'd found, was crumbling again. Warren? Zarya's voice came from behind him. He hadn't heard her come in. He quickly closed the laptop, but not quickly enough. It's nothing, just... They found out, she said simply, setting her library books on the table. About us. Zarya, I'm sorry. I should have known this would happen. Maybe we should. Warren. Her voice was calm, steady. Do you know what I learned about chess from watching all those YouTube videos? He looked at her, confused by the change of subject. The best players don't win because they never get attacked, she continued. They win because they use attacks against them as opportunities. Turn defense into offense. Warren stared at this extraordinary girl who seemed to understand strategy better than generals twice her age. Let them laugh, Zarya said, pulling out her homework. While they're busy laughing, we'll be busy winning. As Warren watched her settle down to work on problems that would challenge graduate students, he realized she was right. The world could mock him all it wanted, but they had no idea what they were really dealing with. Neither did he, honestly. But he was beginning to understand that sometimes the most powerful moves came from the pieces nobody was watching. The email from the United States Chess Federation arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Warren read it 3 times before believing it was real. Zarya, he called, finding her at the kitchen table working through a quantum physics textbook like it was a comic book. You've been invited to the National Youth Chess Championship. She looked up, pencil still moving as she solved equations in the margins. The one in Washington? The very one. How did you when did you apply? Last week. Online. They have qualifying puzzles on their website. She shrugged, as if infiltrating elite chess circles was as simple as ordering pizza. I solved all of them. Warren's phone buzzed with a call from Rosa at the shelter. Warren, you need to see this. Turn on Channel 7. The news segment was already halfway through when Warren found it. Unprecedented situation where tournament organizers are questioning the eligibility of a 10-year-old player who has no formal chess background or coaching records. What are they saying? Zarya asked, appearing beside him. They're saying you don't belong there, Warren said grimly. That kids from backgrounds like yours couldn't possibly compete at that level without proper training. Zaria's jaw tightened, the first time Warren had seen her show real anger. Want to bet? The video went viral within hours. Someone at the local chess club had recorded Zaria playing against Marcus Chin, a 12-year-old prodigy who'd been featured on magazine covers since age 8. The footage showed Marcus setting up his pieces with practiced confidence while Zaria sat quietly across from him, looking like any other kid from the neighborhood. 2 minutes and 47 seconds later, Marcus was staring at the board in shock as Zaria calmly announced checkmate. I don't understand, Marcus said in the video, his voice cracking. What just happened? You played like someone taught you patterns. Zaria replied gently. But chess isn't patterns. It's seeing what happens when patterns break. The video had over 2 million views by evening, with comments ranging from amazement to suspicion to outright racism. But it also caught the attention of the Peterson Foundation, a tech philanthropy group hosting their annual gala in Chicago. They want to feature Zaria as an example of untapped urban talent, Warren explained as they stood outside the Palmer House Hotel a week later. I hate the way they phrase it, but it's an opportunity. Zaria finished, adjusting the black dress Rosa had helped her pick out. I know. The gala was exactly what Warren expected. A room full of tech billionaires and venture capitalists writing checks to feel better about the inequality they perpetuated. Warren kept his head down, hoping to avoid recognition, but his past was harder to escape than he'd hoped. Well, if it isn't the king of crypto himself. Warren turned to find Marcus Sullivan, his former business partner, the man who'd framed him for the insider trading that destroyed his life. Marcus looked prosperous, surrounded by admirers who hung on his every word about responsible innovation and ethical AI. Marcus, Warren said quietly. Heard you're playing house with some homeless kid now. Marcus continued, loud enough for nearby guests to overhear. What's next, Warren? Gonna adopt your way back to relevance? Other former colleagues began gathering, smelling blood in the water. Warren felt the familiar paralysis that had gripped him during his trial, the helplessness of being attacked by people who knew exactly where to aim their words. Isn't this the guy who lost people's life savings? Someone whispered. My grandmother lost her house because of his scam. Another voice added. Warren's chest tightened. This had been a mistake. He should have known they'd be here, should have realized. Excuse me. The small voice cut through the crowd like a blade. Zaria appeared beside Warren, her chin raised and eyes blazing with an intensity that made grown men step back. I couldn't help overhearing, she said, her voice carrying despite its youth. You're talking about Warren Clay like he's some kind of criminal. But do any of you actually know what happened? Marcus smiled condescendingly. Sweetie, this is adult business. Adult business? Zaria's voice sharpened. You mean the business where adults steal from each other, and then blame the wrong person to cover their tracks? The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Warren watched in amazement as Zaria stepped forward, commanding the attention of people worth billions of dollars. You want to know what I learned living on the streets? She continued. I learned that the people who talk loudest about ethics are usually the ones with the most to hide. I learned that real criminals always have someone else to blame. And I learned that the difference between intelligence and wisdom is knowing when adults are lying to you. She turned to Marcus, her dark eyes boring into his. Warren Clay didn't steal from anyone. But someone in this room did. Someone who was smart enough to make it look like Warren's fault and cowardly enough to let him take the blame. The room had gone completely silent. Marcus's face had gone pale. You want to mock Warren for caring about some homeless kid? Zaria's voice rose, carrying to every corner of the room. Here's what's really happening. While you're all writing checks to feel good about yourselves, Warren is actually building something. Something that uses logic and mathematics to help people like me, people this system forgot, actually build wealth instead of just surviving. She paused, letting her words sink in. You can laugh at us all you want, she said finally. But while you're laughing, we're working. And when we're done, we're going to change how this whole game is played. Warren stared at this extraordinary girl who had just stared down a room full of the most powerful people in tech. Around them, phones were already coming out, recording the speech that would be on every major news network by morning. For the first time in months, Warren Clay felt like himself again. Not because of what anyone else thought of him, but because of what Zarya had helped him remember. Sometimes the most powerful move in any game is refusing to play by the other side's rules. The laptop screen glowed in Warren's small apartment as lines of code scrolled past. It was 3 a.m., and he'd been programming for 6 straight hours, fueled by coffee and the kind of electric energy he hadn't felt since his Harvard days. Beside him, Zarya sat cross-legged on the couch, simultaneously reviewing chess notation and sketching mathematical models on graph paper. "Try running the emotional volatility module again," she said without looking up from her work. "But this time, weighted against the collective fear index we built yesterday." Warren's fingers flew across the keyboard. The algorithm they'd been developing for 3 weeks was unlike anything he'd ever created. Where his original Claystone platform had been purely mathematical, Claynova, as Zarya had dubbed it, was something entirely different. It was mathematics informed by human nature, logic tempered by emotional intelligence. "Zarya," Warren said, staring at the simulation results. "Look at this." She glanced over at the screen, where their beta platform was running test scenarios against historical market data. In every simulation, Claynova was outperforming not just the market, but Warren's original billion-dollar algorithm. "Of course it's working," she said matter-of-factly. "We're not trying to predict what the market should do. We're predicting what scared people will do with their money." The breakthrough had come when Zarya explained how she approached chess against emotional opponents. "Most people play chess like they're fighting the board," she told him. "But you're not fighting the board. You're playing against another person who's trying not to lose everything they care about. Once you understand their fear, you can see their moves before they make them." Warren had initially designed Claynova for traditional investors, but Zarya had a different vision. "Why are we helping rich people get richer?" she'd asked during one late-night coding session. "What if we help poor people stop being poor?" That simple question had revolutionized everything. Instead of a platform for hedge funds, Claynova became something unprecedented, an AI investment tool specifically designed for low-income communities. It could work with tiny amounts, $5, $10, and make micro-investments that traditional platforms ignored. "We're ready," Warren said, saving the final version of their code. "No," Zarya corrected. "We're ready to begin." The first investor meeting was a disaster. Warren sat in a gleaming conference room across from 3 venture capitalists, who'd agreed to hear his pitch mostly out of curiosity. When he mentioned that his 10-year-old partner had designed the core logic, they barely concealed their laughter. "You're asking us to invest in financial software designed by a child," said Patricia Voss, a partner at Meridian Capital. "A child with no formal education, no credentials, no track record. A child who's been managing her own survival for 8 months." Warren replied calmly. "A child who can see patterns that elude PhD economists." "Mr. Clay," interrupted David Kim, another partner. "We appreciate your situation. But we're not a charity. We invest in viable businesses, not feel-good stories." Warren pulled out his laptop and connected it to their projection screen. "Run a simulation. Any market conditions you want. Claynova against any fund you choose." They picked the 2008 financial crisis, the collapse that had destroyed countless investment algorithms. Warren watched their expressions change as Claynova not only navigated the crisis but generated consistent returns throughout the downturn. "How is this possible?" Patricia whispered. "Because it's not trying to outsmart the market," Warren explained. "It's trying to understand human panic. When people are terrified, they make predictable mistakes. Claynova identifies those patterns and positions accordingly." David was frantically taking notes. "What's your target demographic?" "People with less than $1,000 to invest. Single mothers, college students, minimum wage workers. People the financial system has completely ignored." The margins on micro-investments are terrible, Patricia objected. Not if you have 10 million users, Warren countered. And not if your AI is efficient enough to make profitable trades on amounts as small as $5. Within 2 weeks, Warren was fielding calls from investment firms across the country. Claynova's simulation results had leaked, and suddenly everyone wanted in. Goldman Sachs offered to buy the platform outright. JP Morgan wanted exclusive licensing rights. Warren turned them all down. But why? Demanded Sarah Chin, a reporter from TechCrunch who'd been following their story. You could make your fortune back 10 times over. Because that's not what this is about, Warren replied. He and Zaria were sitting in their first real office, a modest space in downtown Chicago, but it was theirs. Claynova isn't about making rich people richer. It's about giving everyone access to the same tools the wealthy use. Even if it means less profit for you? Zaria looked up from her computer, where she was debugging the user interface they'd designed for people with limited tech experience. Profit isn't the point, she said simply. The point is proving that intelligence doesn't care where you were born or how much money your parents had. 3 months later, Warren stared at the cover of Forbes magazine in disbelief. The headline read, "The Homeless Queen Who Saved a King." The photo showed him and Zaria in their office, her nameplate clearly visible. Zaria Williams, co-founder and chief logic officer. How does it feel to be on the cover of Forbes? The photographer had asked Zaria during the shoot. Like the beginning, she'd replied. Not the end. Claynova had launched with 50,000 beta users. Within 6 weeks, that number had grown to 200,000, then 500,000. The platform was generating an average return of 12% annually for users who started with as little as $10. Traditional investment firms were scrambling to understand how a homeless girl and a disgraced billionaire had created something they couldn't replicate. Warren looked across their office at Zaria, who was on a video call with a group of MIT students interested in Claynova's predictive algorithms. She was explaining complex mathematical concepts to graduate students while simultaneously running scenarios for their next platform update. You know what the best part is? Warren said after she ended the call. What? 6 months ago, they laughed at us. Now they're trying to copy us. Zaria smiled, not her cautious, guarded smile, but the genuine expression of someone who had found their place in the world. Warren? Yeah? We're just getting started. Looking at the growth charts on his screen, at the thousands of users who were building wealth for the first time in their lives, Warren believed her completely. The king had found his crown again. But this time, he wasn't ruling alone. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Lincoln Academy's mathematics building as Warren watched Zaria explain quantum probability to a classroom full of gifted 12-year-olds. At 11 now, she was the youngest student in the school's history, but she moved through the advanced curriculum like water flowing downhill, natural, effortless, inevitable. The key thing to remember, Zaria was saying, sketching equations on the whiteboard with confident strokes, is that uncertainty isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature. The universe isn't random, it's playing a game we're still learning the rules to. Warren smiled from his seat in the back of the classroom. 18 months ago, Zaria had been surviving in abandoned laundromats and teaching herself chess with YouTube videos. Now she was guest lecturing at one of the country's most prestigious academies, funded partly by the Claynova Foundation they'd established together. Questions? Zaria asked the class. A boy named Marcus, not the chess prodigy she demolished, but another brilliant kid from the academy, raised his hand. How do you make decisions when you can't calculate all the variables? Same way you play chess, Zaria replied without hesitation. You don't need to see every possible move. You just need to see the pattern of the game you're playing. After class, Warren and Zaria walked across the academy's campus, a converted mansion in Chicago's Lincoln Park that looked nothing like the decrepit shelter where they'd first met. Students from every background imaginable clustered in study groups under ancient oak trees, their voices mixing mathematics with laughter. How was the TED Talk yesterday? Zaria asked as they settled onto a bench overlooking the small lake at the center of campus. Different, Warren admitted. Good different. The talk had been titled, "What a Homeless Girl Taught Me About Success," and Warren had spent 20 minutes explaining how every assumption he'd held about intelligence, worth, and family had been shattered by a 10-year-old with bottle-cap chess pieces. He hadn't talked about Klanova's billion-dollar valuation or their growing influence in fintech. Instead, he talked about learning to see genius in unexpected places, about the difference between being smart and being wise, about how real wealth was measured in lives changed rather than dollars accumulated. The audience was different too, Warren continued. Not just tech executives and investors. Teachers, social workers, foster parents. People who actually work with kids like you. Kids like me, Zaria repeated thoughtfully. You mean brilliant kids who happen to be poor? I mean kids the system overlooks, Warren corrected gently. Kids who could change the world if someone just gave them the tools. That was why they'd started the Academy Partnership Program. For every affluent student Lincoln Academy enrolled, they sponsored a scholarship for a child from underserved communities. Zaria had insisted on personally reviewing every application, using criteria that had nothing to do with test scores and everything to do with what she called survival intelligence. Warren, Zaria said suddenly, do you ever miss it? Your old life? Warren considered the question as he watched students feed ducks at the lake's edge. Did he miss the private jets, the penthouse offices, the intoxicating rush of billion-dollar deals? Did he miss being feared and envied by powerful men who measured their worth in Forbes rankings? I miss the confidence, he said finally. The certainty that I knew how the world worked. But I don't miss being wrong about everything that actually mattered. Like what? Like thinking intelligence was about credentials instead of insight. Like believing success meant beating everyone else instead of lifting everyone up. Like assuming family meant people who shared your DNA instead of people who chose to love you. Zaria was quiet for a long moment. I never had a family before, she said softly. I mean, I had my mom, but that was different. Harder. She loved me, but she was sick, and love doesn't cure addiction. Warren felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever Zaria mentioned her mother. He'd learned not to fill these silences with platitudes or false reassurances. Sometimes the most loving thing you could do was simply witness someone's pain. I used to think families were about taking care of each other, Zaria continued. But that's not right, is it? Families are about helping each other become who they're supposed to be. When did you get so wise? Warren asked, though he already knew the answer. Wisdom came from surviving things that should have broken you and choosing to use that survival to help others. I learned from the best, she said with a grin that reminded him how young she still was, despite everything. They walked home in comfortable silence, through neighborhoods that had become as familiar as the shelter once was. Their apartment was larger now, a real two-bedroom place with actual furniture and a dedicated study space for Zaria's ever-expanding collection of textbooks. But it still felt like them, practical, unpretentious, filled with books and chess sets and the quiet contentment of people who had found their place in the world. After dinner, while Warren read through Klanova user testimonials, stories of single mothers buying their first homes, college students graduating debt-free, elderly people securing their retirements, Zaria quietly set up the chess board on their kitchen table. She did this at least twice a week, usually without announcement or fanfare. It had become their ritual, their way of staying connected to the moment that had started everything. Warren looked up from his laptop to find her sitting across from him, the wooden pieces arranged in perfect starting formation. Her expression was expectant, challenging, affectionate all at once. Really? Warren said, closing his computer. I just finished debugging the new user interface. My brain is fried. Your brain is never fried, Zaria replied, already moving her first pawn. And besides, I've been working on a new opening strategy. Want to see it? Warren grinned as he settled into his chair across from her. After 18 months of regular games, he'd managed to win exactly once, and he was pretty sure she'd let him. But that wasn't the point anymore. The point was this: the quiet moments between moves, the gentle competition that strengthened rather than divided them, the reminder that the most important victories weren't about defeating your opponent, but about challenging each other to grow. "You know you'll never go easy on me, huh?" Warren said, moving his own opening pawn. Zarya smirked, the same expression she'd worn when she'd first demolished Big Jim with bottle caps and buttons, but softer now, warmed by love and security and the knowledge that she belonged somewhere. "Wouldn't be love if I did," she said, and moved her knight into play. Outside their window, Chicago hummed with its usual energy, millions of people pursuing their own versions of success, most of them unaware that the most important game being played was happening at a kitchen table between a former billionaire and a girl who taught him that true wealth couldn't be measured in dollars. Warren studied the board, planning his next move, and realized that for the first time in his life, he'd already won everything that mattered.